Hi everyone. Today we're going to be talking about scaling Apple solutions with Jamf during a global pandemic. We're both from Jigsaw24, a Jamf Gold reseller. We were the first Apple authorized enterprise reseller in the UK, as well as being a certified service provider and a authorized education specialist. I'm Jack Hollister. I'm the technical lead for Workplace Solutions. I work with all of our key vendors as the sort of technical authority for our workplace portfolio. And I've also got my colleague Liam, which I'll just pass over to now.
Yeah, and I'm Liam Donnelly. I'm a pre-sale solution consultant in Jigsaw24. Essentially what that means is I kind of look after all of our customers, whoever they are, and kind of work with them on understanding their needs around managing Apple devices, and then how work with them also then to come up with solutions to help make those needs a reality and help them be successful in managing Apple devices moving forwards.
So what we're going to talk about today is two quite large deployments of iOS devices that we used with Jamf Pro during the COVID-19 global pandemic. There was two major projects. The first one being around the test sites. The UK government had test sites dotted around the country where people would go get their tests. This was like a very paper-based process, which is a challenge given the how it scaled out throughout the rest of the pandemic and how we move that to a digital Apple-focused solution. The second project is around the care homes in the UK, which was the government wanting to get 11,000 devices into 9,000 care homes in time for the holiday period. Both of these projects were delivered completely remotely while we was all in lockdown, and our teams at Jigsaw sourced the hardware, we managed the devices, we staged, deployed the devices, and supported the users. So starting off, the first challenge is that was initially 2,000 devices to go into the test sites for the staff to use. There was a couple of applications that were used to replace those paper-based workflows that we spoke about. The main goal of that project was around getting an iPhone into the hands of that user that was already configured and set up. It was managed by an MDM. It was secure, given the nature of how the applications are being used and them being shared devices. Security and privacy was at the forefront of that. We had a number of applications that had to be deployed, and all behind that had to be supported by a service desk. We, at the start of the project, when we was looking at what tools that was going to be used, we identified Jamf Pro as being the best tool for the job for this, just because of the nature of we wanted to be able to expedite and make deployment as efficient as possible. So things like the Jamf Smart Groups, the Jamf API really were sort of like key unique features that we needed for this project to be a success. If I pass over to Liam now, who'll now talk about what that initial deployment looked like from a technical point of view for our staging team.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So kind of taking everything that Jack just said, really, we had a very short turnaround to get our first initial build out. We needed a build that supported mainly two applications in the beginning. One application to help sort of check people into the site, and then another to help assign things like test kits to the correct users as well, to enable more efficiency in the person coming to site and then the person leaving site. So that whole process turning around a lot quicker. And kind of taking that all in context, we needed a build process that scaled. So like Jeff said, needed a build process that would scale up to 2,000 devices. We needed a build process that allowed us to stage the devices effectively as well. So we have maybe not as technical people and not as Jamf orientated people staging these devices. We needed a build process that was clear, precise, things happened at the right times, and there was less room to and less prone to fail as it was going through this build process to help reduce any issues. So here we kind of came up with, so this was part one of kind of the build process that we came up with, using automated enrollment, and kind of going from left to right, and with the orange kind of being the main sort of process, the blue being the automated things happening in the background from a Jamf perspective, and then the red being some additional API things that we had going on in the background. And utilizing this approach and utilizing Jamf-specific technology and smart groups, we're able to do this. So at certain stages during the build, you'll kind of notice that things are happening at certain times. And this would be because devices would fall into these smart groups, and then we could scope and do specific actions based on device membership and within that specific smart group. So one really useful thing here is we could actually change the wallpaper. So at the beginning, we had a building please wait sort of wallpaper screen, so the person staging the device knew what was happening. And then as we sort of went through that process, we then had a Azure serverless function running in the background to help automate a lot of and sort of automatically push out a lot of the things that would typically be manual in a sort of iPhone sort of deployment. And one of those is enable data roaming. You enable today, so in case you aren't sure, enabling data roaming is only possible as a sort of a remote command. So we needed a way to do that without any sort of manual intervention and without having to go in and log into the Jamf console for us to do that ourselves. We then took that further to push to do a blank push. So if we have, and we're staging lots of devices at once, we could potentially see certain queue up of commands where we then used that command to then do a blank push, would help force that through, and then update inventory as well. So the devices went from one smart group to the next smart group, and then the next phase of that workflow would happen. And we kind of work our way through, and as the change in smart groups happen, the apps get installed, the home screen layout is changing, the applications are installed, we need to change the home screen layout. We need to apply the passcode during this section as well, just to prevent the device being locked, because when the device is locked, the update inventory and some other commands wouldn't naturally go through. So we apply the passcode at the right point, and then gets to the final smart group, final wallpaper is applied, so the staging engineer knows that the device has gone through its build and the build has been successful because it meets the criteria that we set within our Jamf solution. And this particular workflow was only really possible using the Jamf technology, using the Jamf smart group technology in that, and building that more complex workflow, and then utilizing the extensive API as well. And then the situation started to ramp up, and I'm going to hand over to Jack now to talk a little bit about that.
Yep. So that configuration that we just mentioned for those 2,000 devices, sort of single use case device, was great for that use case. But as it progressed through April, as lockdown sort of worsened, practically overnight, it was announced that the government wanted to achieve 100,000 tests a day, which is a much higher number than perhaps what they was achieving at the start of April. Now, with that, it now suddenly meant that the estate was going to grow dramatically. There was going to be more sites across the country, different use cases, new applications are going to be used to replace some of those, as we mentioned, the paper-based workflows, which then in turn now means new builds for the devices. So now suddenly we'd need to reimagine how an estate that's already in the wild can now grow and be modified so that we can sort of hit this target of being able to get enough devices out configured so that the government can achieve this within by the end of April. And now Liam's just going to run through that change to the workflow and the sort of the new technologies we brought into place.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. So yeah, as Jack sort of mentioned, there was a lot of challenges that started to sort of come. So as with that ramp up, and as that ramp up started to get larger, and in the short sort of timeframes that we had, a lot of the build that we initially placed, we started to clone. So we ended up with quite a sort of a busy Jamf environment A lot of cloning was happening. Things were being sort of duplicated in the environment, and it become a little bit challenged to manage. To kind of get over that initial hurdle, we used a Mac application called MUT, which is essentially stands for Mass Update Tool. And this is a really good solution because it allows you to mass upload data within your Jamf environment. So this was used at the beginning to allow the staging team to mass upload data to get the devices into the correct build process, into the correct pre-stage. So then the correct build would then happen. And then we were also able to mass upload inventory type data. So using the Jamf solution as a way of inventory management, knowing which devices are at which sites, because there was hundreds and hundreds of sites and we needed to know where the devices were at each site. So as I kind of mentioned, there was a lot of challenges that came with this, and sort of started to become more apparent. With these sort of short turnaround times, more sites were coming in, more roles were being developed within these test sites, more roles were being digitized, so more applications were required for specific roles, specific management roles, for example, and required applications to upload data to make the sites even more efficient so they could get in more tests and more users in, more people in to the site and out of the site as quick as possible. And we were sort of staging potentially up to 600 devices per day. Devices were coming in back from sites because that site had been maybe particularly shut down and another site created. So devices were constantly going through our staging team from one sort of venue and then to another all the time with very sort of little notice as well. And then a lot of the issues we saw as well around data roaming SIM cards. So for data roaming SIM cards, we needed to stage the devices on a Wi-Fi network because we needed to push down APN setting configurations onto the device for them to actually initially work. We then also had to do the API command to help automate the enabling of the data roaming as well. So as we started to grow, the Azure serverless functions, having to run on a very regular basis. Our build was dependent on bundle ID, and typically this would be fine. The bundle ID should almost never change. And the reason why it was on the bundle ID was because the application names were changing throughout the project. The project was very fast moving. Things were ever changing. Names were changing because we started to see maybe more efficient of an app being named a certain way. This became an issue later down the line because the applications moved from one application development team to another. Unfortunately, that had to be a change of Apple enterprise accounts, so change of bundle ID, which the build was dependent on as well. So this provided us a couple of challenges. We sat down in a room kind of discussing them and to kind of how we can make this more efficient. And essentially, this is what we ended up on. So we did a couple of things here, and you can see that this build process has reduced quite massively. So there's a couple of things we did. So one thing we did was remove data roaming SIM cards. And there's pros and cons to each. So we actually went with a single carrier, which allowed us to then stage these devices because we still needed to stage the devices, and zero touch was never part of this workflow. We needed to make sure devices reached the site and they were fully configured. So we're able to stage the devices more easily. There was no need for us to push down any APN settings. There was also no need for the API to enable data roaming. The passcode now can also then now be applied during the setup. So what basically allowing us to kind of have a more streamlined, again, an even better approach to staging these devices and with less sort of manual intervention. And that was all made possible with the introduction of Jamf Setup. So Jamf Setup typically is for building devices to have multiple personas. And it's used a lot in sort of shared environments where you have multiple different roles and you've got shared devices and you want people to be able to go onto the device, maybe log in or select who they are and what their role is, and the device will configure the device based on that. So we kind of used that approach and that technology to apply the same to our staging process. So what we did was we used Jamf Setup to have all of our different builds. So maybe a management type build, someone who's on security, for example, and other roles. So what this allowed was the staging team to completely remove the mass update tool out of the equation. help remove sort of the manual intervention out of the equation as well from the project team to ensure that devices going into the correct builds and the correct data was applied, to having a device in front of them which automatically in the back end going through to the right pre-stage from Apple Business Manager, to turning on that device, going through the staging process, getting to Jamf Setup, selecting the build that they require in Jamf Setup. That build is then applied, and away we go. So we ended up with from a sort of 5 to 10 minute build process down to about 1 to 2 minutes, and really reduce sort of the manual intervention on the back end side as well. So utilizing the Jamf technology that we had, we're able to make this even more efficient than we did at the beginning. And then just finally on this one, just to touch on some of the technology that we used within Test and Trace, one of them being Jamf Setup, which I mentioned, which really helped us have that multiple build personas for these devices, really sped things up for us on that side within the staging team, because it was clear, it was precise, and we could name it, and we could even technically brand it necessarily to how we wanted to. But that helped us provide a lot of efficiencies there. MUT, again, was a really, really useful tool at that moment in time to be able to mass upload this data into Jamf and not having to go into maybe each record and having to manually put that data in each time. And we're also in control of when that got applied. Azure serverless functions and the API, again, really, really useful, enabling us to automate some of the setup. So again, weren't relying on any sort of manual intervention of someone going into the Jamf console, maybe pushing out any mass actions or going into a device inventory and clearing and sending a blank push to help push things through, or an update inventory. We're able to do those things automatically depending on where they were and depending on membership of the smart group. And then one thing as well that was really quite useful, and again, leveraging the Jamf API technology, is we had a lot of scripts within the service desk. And a couple of the scripts that we created, and one really useful script definitely was the success. So a lot of the issues which I spoke around about data roaming, we needed to collect statistics on app updates. And the reason for this was on a data roaming SIM card. Unfortunately, it prompts the user if they want to update or not, which obviously gives the user a chance to click no. So we needed to collect those statistics and pass them to the project team within Slack, so everyone knew what was going on. And then we also had scripts to do things like clear failed commands. So this enabled any sort of commands or remote commands that failed for any reason because of a technology sort of issue, or maybe the network went down or anything like that, we're able to clear that en masse instead of, again, having to go into each inventory, each device inventory to clear that. So it really helped, again, speed things up. And the whole API technology and the technology around that we used really helped us be a lot more efficient and work on the short turnaround times for Test and Trace. So that's Test and Trace. I'm going to pass over to Jack now to talk a little bit about our care homes project.
Yep. So the second project was around a scheme the UK government put in place, where the plan was that they wanted to get 11,000 iPads into 9,000 care homes, with the idea, especially as it was the winter period, was heading into holiday season, and they wanted to be able to let those elderly and vulnerable individuals within the care homes to still remain digitally connected with friends and family, and also still be able to sort of have doctor's appointments and that without them having to leave the premises. The goal and sort of the agenda for the project was slightly different when we was working with the NHS on this. There was one consistent sort of message throughout, which was on Christmas Day, we want to be able to ensure that all these are in the hands, so that when that day arrives, they can have their Christmas morning, do their call, be able to still video call, see everyone on Christmas Day. And that was like a real big, like, throughout all conversations, it was like, that's the end goal. That's what we want to achieve here. All the technology aside, given the what was happening in the world, this was a big focus. Now, the solution. So the iPad themselves were going to be a shared device. So both residents and the caregivers were going to be able to use this device. Now, given the nature of sort of healthcare and sort of the data that's on those devices, the privacy and the security of the device was pretty much at the forefront, but also making sure that we didn't compromise any user experience while restricting a device's settings. So we used some of the builds and some of the profiles that we generated from the first project, and could use those same practices within this scenario. We had Jamf virtual visits as an application on that device, as a way of sort of securely and privately generating video call sessions, which was then to be used for, say, friends and family, or when having a doctor's appointment, being able to do it all through the iPad, and those caregivers being able to support that resident so that they can still remain digitally connected. We had like an app store like experience using self-service. We used the app request function so that when they wanted new applications on those devices, they could then request it. It went into the service desk. It was then be able to ensure that it's a safe, secure application, and then it would be rolled out to the estate. Now, the project sort of lead time that we had for this is that once the environment was built, we had around about 2 weeks to get these devices out. Bearing in mind that the goal was around having the devices in hand in time for Christmas. 2 weeks is a lot to get 11,000 devices built, but we average around about 750 devices a day, and we got this graph from our virtual visits console where we can actually see the numbers of sessions ramp up, and we can see the highest peak being the December 25th, so that when Christmas arrived, all those devices were in hand, and we saw such a sort of large bump in traffic on virtual visits, which was great to see that side of the project be a success, as well as all the technology and solution aside. So these two projects, very large estates, very short times to get things up and running, lots of quick thinking on our feet while we were developing this all at home. One of the key areas that we saw is that especially when working with sort of such large organisations, insight into how those devices are being used and what's happening on the devices is really valuable. And being able to generate that information in a user-friendly way was sort of a big requirement. So for the projects, we created our application, which was Command24. So that would then go into the hands of the customer's project team. As we see from the screenshots there, like we've been able to build their own dashboards, being able to get insight metrics, notifications around what's happening within their estate, so that they don't need to reach out to the service desk. And perhaps they don't need to, some of those sort of first line tickets around sort of inventory, locking a device if it's been lost or stolen, being able to wipe a device securely. Some of those sort of first line tasks, we can actually then empower the project team so that they can then deliver that themselves, which is a much better user experience, sort of end to end for the end user as well as the team running the project. Now, as we leave lockdown and sort of taking those learnings right from the start, so those sort of shell scripts that service desks use pass through to our Command24 application, we now look at how can we do this across our whole estate. And we have our Jigsaw24 platform, which we call Ella, which is short for Endpoint Lifecycle Automation, which is all around the lifecycle of all of our managed devices. And building automations around that. So whether that's doing dashboards, integrating with MDM solutions such as Jamf, being able to pull that data out and make it as sort of customer friendly as possible. And sort of as that's developed out, when we've got our 6 main pillars here of our platform, we can see things like the reporting section there, which is sort of clearly an ongoing development that started from these projects, being able to run compliance assessments, being able to sort of, because we were working with the security teams, and given the nature of those devices, security was a constant conversation, So being able to do those like audits and put them against the benchmarks of the security industry. We now have tools and workflows that all operate out of our Ella platform. And then both of these estates being iOS, we're taking some of these sort of like the mindset and the workflows and sort of then branched out into our large macOS estate. So being able to do guided Jamf onboarding for customers, automating some of those sort of repetitive tasks, manage customers getting a consistent experience when they're being onboarded into service, sort of benefiting not only the service desk that's supporting the devices, but the engineers that are going out to then deploy that. And things like patch management, being able to deploy apps with that Apple experience at the forefront, so that sort of App Store like, being able to push out your applications, push out your updates, and sort of guiding the user along that journey, still providing them that level of insight, but then giving the technical teams all that information they need to sort of remain compliant. So to recap on those two projects, test and trace, 17,000 devices deployed, managed and supported by a Jigsaw team. Probably would like to sort of call out here, so it wouldn't be possible without a professional services team that sort of built and configured that environment, our managed services team that sort of that looked after it in life, our staging team that was doing those 750 devices a day, and sort of everyone sort of surrounding that project. We mentioned at the start around that 100,000 tests a day. That then exceeded sort of 500,000 tests per day. So the devices were sort of key to sort of the government being able to sort of achieve that level of tests. So all those efficiencies being driven from Jamf, bringing down the build time from sort of 10 minutes to 2 minutes, sort of only being made possible with Jamf Pro as a solution there. And yes, and the care homes, virtual visits, such a core part of that, with being able to sort of have as that secure communication channel for the residents of the care home. And again, sort of like the additional features around self-service, around app requests, being able to still remain sort of that layer of security around installing applications and sort of matching that Apple experience as much as possible. Liam, I don't know if you had any other sort of points we wanted to recap here.
Yeah, I think the main point really here is that both solutions scaled very quickly, and I don't think we'd be able to do that without Jamf Pro, without the software, without the workflow capabilities, and without all the sort of technology integrations that go around that. So the Jamf solution and the technology really helped us to accommodate the fast scaling of this. Was kind of the whole point of the presentation and things as well. That was the technology enabled us to be able to be successful to get these devices into hands and being used for these critical projects that provided a big impact on a lot of people's lives within the UK. So it was really great to be part of that. And like Jack said, wouldn't have been possible really without the teams and the professional services and the managed services teams that we have within Jigsaw.
And yeah, thanks everyone for listening to our talk. I'm Jack Hollister at Jigsaw24.